A single open steam valve sitting inside a flooded boiler room 2,500 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic just rewrote the last 2 hours of the most famous maritime disaster in human history. Not a theory, not a survivor's memory that could be doubted or argued against. A physical object, frozen exactly where it was left by the last human hands to touch it on the night of April 14, 1912, captured in perfect detail by underwater scanning technology that did not exist 5 years ago. That valve was open because 35 men chose to stay at their posts in a boiler room that was filling with the cold sea around them, shoveling coal into furnaces to keep the electricity running, to keep the lights burning, to keep the wireless transmitter sending distress calls into the dark North Atlantic so that other people, strangers to them, would have a chance at survival. The drone footage confirmed what survivors said and what history doubted for over a century. Those men never left. They stayed until the hull tore apart around them, and that single open valve, sitting exactly where it was left, is the proof. This is what happens when you finally have a machine capable of going inside the Titanic and actually looking. Not circling the exterior, not photographing the bow from a safe distance. Going inside, into the corridors and compartments that have been completely sealed in total darkness since the night the ship sank, and recording what is still there. For the first time in history, that has now been done. In 2022, deep-sea mapping company Magellan sent 2 underwater robots to the Titanic wreck site, 375 miles south of Newfoundland, and spent 3 weeks working without stopping. They produced 16 terabytes of data. They captured 715,000 individual still images. They recorded footage in 4K quality. And from all of that material, after nearly 2 years of processing and analysis, they built something that no one had ever built before, a complete full-scale digital twin of the Titanic wreck, accurate down to every single rivet. National Geographic presented the findings in the documentary Titanic, The Digital Resurrection, which premiered on April 11th, 2025, the 113th anniversary year of the sinking. What that digital twin showed, when experts could finally walk through it at full scale and examine every section without the limitations and dangers of physical exploration, shocked every researcher who had spent their career studying the ship. The Titanic carried approximately 2,920 people on its maiden voyage. More than 1,500 of them died. For 113 years, the accepted version of what happened in the final hours of that ship was assembled from the testimonies of the roughly 710 people who survived, testimony given under conditions of trauma and grief in the days and weeks after the disaster, compared against each other, filtered through the limitations of human memory, and shaped by the passage of more than a century. What the Magellan survey delivered for the first time was something entirely different. Not memory, not theory, not a partial view captured during a brief and dangerous physical dive. A complete, permanent, full-scale record of every external surface and many interior spaces of the wreck, precise enough to read serial numbers on propeller blades, to identify the exact size and shape of holes punched through steel hull plating by contact with ice, and to determine from the position of a mechanical component exactly what a specific human being was doing in the last moments of his life. The age of guessing about the Titanic is over. What replaced it is harder to look at. Before any of those findings can land with their proper weight, you have to understand what it actually takes to reach the Titanic. The wreck sits at approximately 12,500 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic. At that depth, the pressure of the water above is roughly 380 times greater than the pressure at sea level. That number means nothing until you understand what it does to ordinary materials. Metals that seem solid at the surface are compressed and stressed at that depth in ways that can cause them to fail without warning. Electronics that function perfectly in normal conditions can be destroyed by the pressure before they ever reach the wreck. A human being in the water at that depth would be crushed in a fraction of a second. Even the most advanced submersibles carrying human passengers face extraordinary risk, a fact made brutally clear in June of 2023 when the Ocean Gate submersible Titan imploded during a Titanic dive, killing all 5 people aboard. No human being can explore the deep sections of the Titanic safely. The only way in is to send something that has no body to loose. The drones Magellan sent were built for exactly this. Their frames were constructed from titanium and specially developed alloys, materials strong enough to resist the crushing forces of the deep ocean while remaining light enough for precise maneuvering through tight spaces. Every seal was tested repeatedly. Every joint was verified. A single small flaw in any seal would allow the pressure to force water inside the electronics housing instantly, destroying the drone and losing everything it had recorded. The lighting system required careful engineering specifically for the Titanic's interior. Too much light stirs up the silt and fine particles that cover every surface of the wreck after more than a century underwater, creating a thick, cloudy haze that makes cameras useless. The lights had to be powerful enough to illuminate narrow passages while gentle enough to avoid triggering visibility-destroying silt clouds. The cameras were capable of capturing detail so fine that researchers could read engravings on objects and identify the texture of individual surfaces from footage alone. Laser scanning tools generated precise three-dimensional models of spaces as the drone moved through them, creating measurements accurate enough for structural engineers to analyze the forces that tore the ship apart. All of this data traveled back up through a tether cable to the surface vessel in real time, allowing operators to guide every movement while watching exactly what the drone was seeing. The wreck itself, even before the drones entered the interior, had already changed significantly since it was first discovered by oceanographer Robert Ballard in 1985. The 2024 expedition by RMS Titanic Inc., the company holding the legal salvage rights to the wreck, found that a 15-foot section of the famous bow railing that had been intact in every photograph for 4 decades had collapsed and now rested on the seafloor below. That railing had appeared in more photographs of the Titanic than almost any other single feature of the wreck. Its disappearance was described by the expedition team as a stark reminder of the ongoing and inevitable decay of the site. Every year that passes, the rusticles, those rust-colored bacterial formations that hang from every metal surface of the wreck like strange orange stalactites, continue consuming the iron structure. Every year, sections that seemed stable collapse. Researchers working with the Magellan scan data have been able to identify sections currently at the highest risk of total collapse, allowing future teams to prioritize what to document before it is gone forever. The interior of the Titanic presents challenges that go beyond the engineering ones. The walls are unstable. Entire sections of ceiling have collapsed inward at sharp angles. Metal fragments that were once part of structural beams now hang loose from rusted attachment points, ready to drop if disturbed. Corridors that were wide enough for passengers to walk 3 abreast have narrowed or collapsed entirely. Other sections, protected by the cold and low oxygen of the deep, have remained in a state of preservation that is genuinely unsettling to observe. Chairs standing upright, tables still in position, dishes scattered across the floor of what was once a dining room, many of them intact, suitcases with their clasps still closed, a single wine bottle sitting upright, its cork still sealed, exactly where someone set it down or where the rush of water placed it during the sinking. These objects are not just relics, they are evidence. The near-freezing water below a certain depth, combined with very low oxygen levels, slows the decay of organic material in ways that allow things made of leather, fabric, and wood to survive for extraordinary spans of time. The cold that kills preserves what it touches with absolute impartiality. What the drone found inside the Titanic, in sections that had been completely sealed and inaccessible since 1912, was a layered set of discoveries that each, individually, would have been the headline finding of any previous expedition. Together, they form the most complete and most disturbing picture of the final hours of this ship that has ever been assembled from physical evidence, rather than survivor memory or theoretical reconstruction. Start with the boiler room. Boiler Room 2 of the Titanic is the place where, according to survivor testimony gathered in the weeks after the disaster, a team of engineers under the leadership of Chief Engineer Joseph Bell stayed at their stations long after it was clear the ship was going to sink. These men were responsible for keeping the coal furnaces burning, which kept the steam pressure up, which kept the electrical generators running, which kept the lights on throughout the ship, and kept the wireless Marconi transmitter operating, so that distress signals could be sent and received. Their survival was never plausible once the hull began to fail around them. They knew they were not going to escape. They stayed anyway. Survivor accounts from passengers and crew who made it off the ship describe the lights remaining on almost until the very end of the sinking, which took approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes from the moment of the iceberg collision. Those accounts had always been treated with the uncertainty that applies to any human memory from a chaotic and traumatic night. There was no physical evidence one way or the other, until the Magellan scan revealed the open steam valve. A steam valve left in the open position in Boiler Room 2 means exactly one thing. Steam was still flowing from the furnaces into the electricity generating system when the last person to touch that valve was killed. The valve was not closed because the man whose hand was on it did not close it. He could not close it. The ship tore apart around him, as Titanic analyst Park Stevenson described it, before he had any chance to do anything but keep working. Stevenson, who was part of the expert team analyzing the Magellan digital twin for the National Geographic documentary, described standing virtually inside Boiler Room 2 using the full-scale digital model and understanding for the first time, viscerally, what those 35 men actually did and where they actually stood when they died. The open valve did not just confirm the survivor accounts. It confirmed the character of the men behind those accounts. They did their duty to the very end, as Stevenson put it. That is not a historical abstraction anymore. It is a physical fact sitting on the seafloor. The question of how the Titanic actually broke apart as it sank has been debated by engineers and historians for decades. Survivor accounts describe the ship splitting in two. Early analysis of the wreck, after Ballard's discovery, confirmed that the bow and stern had indeed separated and come to rest roughly 2,600 feet apart on the ocean floor. But the mechanism and violence of that separation had been interpreted through the lens of incomplete information. The assumption was that the ship split in a roughly clean break as the stern rose into the air and the stresses on the hull became too great to bear. The Magellan scan data, specifically the work of digitally reassembling the hundreds of hull fragments scattered across the 15-square-mile debris field surrounding the wreck, revealed something fundamentally different from that relatively orderly image. The Titanic did not split cleanly, it was violently torn apart. Naval architect Simon Benson from the University of Newcastle, working with the digital simulation data, determined that the entire iceberg collision from first contact to full scraping impact took just 6.3 seconds. In those 6.3 seconds, the iceberg raked along the hull in a glancing blow rather than a direct impact, punching a series of holes described as roughly the size of an A4 sheet of paper through the steel plating below the waterline. Small holes, each one, but positioned across 5 of the 16 supposedly watertight compartments, and enough to seal the ship's fate. The tearing apart of the hull as the stern rose was not a gradual structural separation. The scan shows the evidence of a catastrophic and violent event that ripped through the first-class section of the ship. This matters because it means that some of the most prominent passengers aboard, people like Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest men in the world at the time, and Benjamin Guggenheim, the businessman who famously dressed in his best clothes and declared that he would die like a gentleman, may have been sheltering in first-class cabins in that section of the ship when it was violently ripped apart. That section was not destroyed by the slow progression of flooding and the gradual sinking of a vessel settling into the dark. It was destroyed by sudden and overwhelming force. The scan does not tell us exactly where these men were when they died, but it tells us the violence of what happened to that part of the ship. And in doing so, it gives their final moments a physical reality that no account written from memory had ever quite conveyed. The iceberg collision itself was simulated with more precision than any previous reconstruction had achieved. The smashed porthole identified in the scan, combined with the line of holes found along the hull below the waterline, allowed Dr. Jennifer Hooper, a materials scientist working with the documentary team, to determine something that eyewitness accounts had always hinted at but never confirmed with physical evidence. First-class passenger Margaret Swift reported seeing pieces of ice inside her cabin, ice that had come through a porthole. The smashed porthole visible in the scan matches that account. And the height of the ice damage on the hull, combined with the size and position of the porthole, allowed researchers to calculate something previously only estimated. The iceberg that sank the Titanic extended at least 30 feet above the waterline. The scan is not just telling us about the ship, it is telling us about the iceberg too. 6.3 seconds of contact with an object that tall and that solid, raking along the hull at the angle the simulation shows, produced exactly the pattern of damage that the scan records. 5 compartments flooded. 16 would have needed to be open to the sea for the ship's engineers to stand any chance of controlling the intake. The ship was designed to survive 4 compartments flooding. 5 was one too many. 1 second shorter of contact with the iceberg might have saved more than 14,500 lives. The scan makes that arithmetic physically visible in a way that no previous tool could. Then there is First Officer William Murdoch. For over a century, Murdoch's name has been attached to one of the most persistent and painful accusations to survive from the disaster. Eyewitness accounts, disputed from the moment they were given, claim to have seen a ship's officer shoot 2 men who were rushing a lifeboat and then turn the gun on himself. James Cameron's 1997 film, which became the highest-grossing film ever made at the time of its release, depicted Murdoch as a man who took bribes, shot passengers, and died by his own hand in a moment of cowardice and despair. That depiction caused deep and lasting pain in Murdoch's hometown of Dalbeattie in Scotland, where his family and the community had always insisted he behaved with courage and devotion to duty until the end. The accusation was never proven. It was also never disproven, because the only evidence either way came from human memory on a chaotic night when nobody was documenting what officers were doing. The Magellan scan found a lifeboat David, the mechanical crane used to lower lifeboats over the side of the ship, positioned on the starboard side in a configuration that tells a specific story. Its position shows that Murdoch's crew was actively in the process of preparing a lifeboat launch at the moment the starboard side was engulfed. This physical evidence corroborates the testimony of Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who stated that Murdoch was washed off the ship by the sea as it came over the deck while he and his crew were working to launch the lifeboat. Murdoch did not abandon his post. He was swept away while doing his job. After 113 years, the evidence sitting on the bottom of the North Atlantic has finally said so. Beyond the individual discoveries, the scale of what the Magellan digital twin represents for the future of Titanic research is itself extraordinary. The wreck is decaying at a rate that cannot be reversed or stopped. Every expedition physically present at the site risks disturbing the already fragile structure, the bacteria consuming the ironwork continuously, and no human intervention can slow them. Parts of the ship that were photographed in 1985 are gone. Parts that were photographed in 2010 are gone. The bow railing that was present on every dive for nearly 40 years is now on the seafloor. The digital twin captured the wreck exactly as it appeared in 2022, accurate down to the rivet, and that capture will never decay. Researchers who have not yet been born will be able to examine every section of the Titanic in full scale, in complete detail, without ever risking their lives or further disturbing the site. The ship that is slowly disappearing on the ocean floor has been preserved in digital form as it appeared on one specific day in 2022, and that preserved version will exist as long as the data can be maintained and copied. Something that the scan revealed about the overall condition of the wreck deserves its own attention. The bow of the Titanic, the section that plunged first and fastest and buried itself deepest in the ocean floor sediment, is the part most people picture when they think of the wreck. That iconic image of the bow rising from the darkness, the prow cutting upward through the black water toward a surface it will never reach again, has defined the visual identity of this wreck since Ballard's first photographs in 1985. The 2024 RMS Titanic expedition found that the bow railing on the port side, a 15-foot section that had been present and intact in every photograph and dive footage for nearly 4 decades, had collapsed. It fell as a single piece and now rests on the seafloor beneath where it once stood. That specific loss was documented in the expedition's own press release, described as a stark reminder that the ship is an ongoing and inevitable decay. The Magellan digital twin captured the railing as it appeared in 2022 before that section fell. The collapse documented in 2024 means that even the 2022 scan is already a historical record of something that no longer exists as it was captured. Every year the ship disappears a little more. Every year, a little more of the physical evidence of what happened in 1912 dissolves into rust and collapses into the silt. The digital twin is the most important preservation act in the history of this site precisely because the physical site cannot be preserved. The 15-square-mile debris field surrounding the wreck is itself a record that the scan documented in a level of detail that was previously impossible. Pocket watches, purses, gold coins, hair combs, shoes scattered across the silt. Hundreds of personal objects belonging to people who came aboard the Titanic carrying them as ordinary possessions and never reached New York. Historian Yasmin Khan from the University of Oxford, working with the documentary team, was able to connect some of these specific objects to their individual owners, using passenger records to put names to the things that remain on the seafloor. A watch found in a specific location, a bag that belonged to a specific person in a specific cabin. The debris field is not anonymous. It is a record, and the scan has made it readable in ways that nobody could previously access without physically disturbing the objects. What makes all of this so difficult to process emotionally, and what makes the footage from inside the Titanic so genuinely disturbing to everyone who has watched it closely, is not the horror of the abstract. It is the horror of the specific. It is not frightening because it is dark and deep and unknown. It is frightening because it is known, because the open steam valve is not a symbol. It is the last physical act of 35 real men who had names and families, and who made a choice to stay and die so that others could have a few more minutes of light. Because the hull fragments scattered across 15 square miles are the physical remains of a vessel that once carried real people across the ocean and was torn apart with violence that the people inside it never had time to understand. Because a lifeboat crane frozen in mid-operation is the last second of a man's life. A man who has been called a coward for over a century by people who never knew what the evidence would eventually show. There's one further dimension to this story that deserves to be stated plainly, because it changes how every piece of evidence from the scan should be understood. The Titanic is legally recognized under United States federal law as a memorial site. It is treated as a hallowed gravesite in the exact language used by the U.S. government in its objections to certain types of intervention at the site. More than 1,500 people died there and were never recovered. Their remains, or what remains of them after more than a century in the deep ocean, are part of the site. Every expedition that enters the wreck is entering a place where people died and were never brought home. The ethical weight of that reality shaped every decision made by the Magellan team and the documentary filmmakers. It shapes how the footage is shown and what parts of it are released publicly. The experts working with the digital twin described carrying this awareness through every hour of analysis. The knowledge that the hallways and rooms they were walking through virtually were the last spaces seen by real people on the night of April 14th and the early hours of April 15th, 1912. The Titanic was always more than a shipwreck. It was always the largest monument to human loss that sits on the floor of any ocean, And the century of stories and films and books and documentaries built around it have only made it feel larger and heavier over time. But all of those stories were built from the outside, from survivor memories and theoretical models and partial views of an exterior that the cameras could reach. The drones went inside, the data came back. The findings rewrote things that had been considered settled history for generations. And what they revealed was not the comforting image of a tragedy understood and explained. It was a disaster, more violent, more sudden, and more defined by individual acts of extraordinary courage than anyone had fully realized. The open valve in Boiler Room 2 is the proof. 35 men stayed. The lights stayed on. And the drone found the valve exactly where they left it, 100 years later in the dark.